The smoke curls upward from another cigarette, disappearing into the dim light of a cluttered trailer. Empty beer bottles line the counter. Pill bottles sit alongside them. In the corner, a police badge rests on a worn leather jacket. This is where we first meet Jim Hopper, and this is where his story really begins, though the roots stretch back decades into shadows and secrets he's tried to bury. When we encounter Hopper in the opening moments of Stranger Things, he's not the hero we'll come to know. He's a man barely holding himself together, someone going through the motions of a life that lost meaning years ago. He wakes up in that trailer, reaches for pills before he reaches for breakfast, and stumbles into work with all the enthusiasm of someone attending their own funeral. The chief of police in Hawkins, Indiana, appears to be the least interested person in town when it comes to actual police work. Missing garden gnomes represent the height of local crime, and that's exactly how Hopper seems to prefer it. But underneath that gruff exterior, beneath the chain-smoking cynicism and the alcoholic haze, there's a man carrying wounds that never healed. There's a father who lost his daughter, a soldier haunted by war, a detective who saw too much darkness, a husband whose marriage crumbled under the weight of grief. The man we see slouching behind his desk, dismissing concerns and radiating exhaustion, is the culmination of tragedies that would break most people. He's not lazy or incompetent. He's surviving, barely, in the only way he knows how. The genius of Hopper's character lies in how his past slowly reveals itself, like a photograph developing in a dark room. We don't get his full story dumped on us immediately. Instead, we catch glimpses. A mention of his daughter that makes Joyce go quiet. The way he understands a mother's panic when Will goes missing. The boxes marked Vietnam and New York, hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin. The blue hair ribbon he wears on his wrist that means something profound. Each piece adds to the puzzle of who this man really is, and more importantly, who he used to be before tragedy reshaped him. Understanding Hopper means understanding that he wasn't always this way. There was a time when Jim Hopper was just a kid growing up in Hawkins, attending the local high school, making friends, causing trouble and dreaming about the future. There was a young man who fell in love, became a father, and felt the pure joy of holding his infant daughter for the first time. There was a soldier who served his country with honour, a detective who fought for justice in the big city. But somewhere along the way, between Vietnam and New York, between Sara's death and his return to Hawkins, that man got lost. The question that drives his entire arc is whether he can find his way back. The story of Jim Hopper is ultimately a story about redemption. It's about whether someone can recover from the kind of losses that destroy lives. It's about whether a man convinced he's cursed can learn to love again without fear of losing everything. It's about whether the pieces of a shattered person can be put back together into something not just whole, but stronger than before. To understand his redemption, we have to start at the beginning, back in Hawkins High School, when Jim Hopper was just a teenager with his whole life ahead of him. The boy from Hawkins picture. Hawkins, Indiana, in the late 1950s. A small town where everyone knows everyone, where Friday night football games represent the social highlight of the week, where kids cruise Main Street on Saturday nights, hoping something, anything interesting, might happen. It's the kind of place where leaving feels like the only real adventure possible, where staying means accepting a predictable life of familiar faces and routine existence. For young Jim Hopper, Hawkins was home, but it was also a cage he desperately wanted to escape. Hopper attended Hawkins High School starting in 1957 alongside two people who would remain important throughout his life. Joyce Maldonado, who would later become Joyce Byers, and Bob Newby, the kid everyone called Bob the Brain. The three of them represented different archetypes of small-town teenage life. Bob was the earnest nerd, genuinely enthusiastic about everything from school projects to local radio shows. Joyce was the creative soul, someone who saw beauty and possibility in the world, despite growing up without much money. And Hopper was the charming troublemaker, good-looking enough to get away with more than he should, confident in that way teenagers can be when they haven't yet been broken by reality. Joyce and Hopper developed a particularly close friendship during those high school years. They were the kids who ditched class together, sneaking off to smoke cigarettes during 5th and 6th period, laughing at the absurdity of algebra and the pointlessness of whatever else they were supposed to be learning. On at least one memorable occasion, their teacher Mr. Cooper caught them in the act, prompting a giddy escape as they ran away together, feeling invincible in the teenage way where consequences seem like abstract concepts. These were good times, simple times, before the complications of adulthood crashed down on both of them. Hopper had something of a reputation during his high school years as a ladies' man. He was the kind of guy who knew how to turn on the charm, who could make girls laugh, who exuded confidence. On one occasion, he lied to his mother about being on the debate team when he was actually having relations with a girl named Chrissy Carpenter in the back of his father's Oldsmobile. It's the kind of teenage rebellion that seems significant at the time, but becomes just another fading memory decades later. In 9th grade, around 1956 or 57, he got stood up by a girl named Alice Gilbert, an experience that apparently stuck with him because he'd reference it decades later, noting he hadn't been stood up since. But underneath the swagger and the popularity, there was tension at home. Hopper's relationship with his father was strained, difficult in ways that would shape his entire understanding of what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a father. His dad was harsh, critical, the kind of parent who made his son feel like he could never measure up no matter what he achieved. This toxic dynamic planted seeds of insecurity that would grow throughout Hopper's life, manifesting in his desperate need to prove himself, his fear of failure, his struggle with vulnerability. When Hopper became a father himself, he would overcompensate, trying to be everything his own father wasn't, though the shadow of that relationship would continue haunting him. The comfortable rhythm of high school life, with its social hierarchies and petty dramas, came to an abrupt end in 1959. Hopper was 18 years old, probably thinking about graduation, maybe considering what came next. College wasn't really in the cards financially. Maybe he'd get a job locally, settle down in Hawkins like so many before him. Maybe he'd find a way out to something bigger. These idle plans dissolved the moment he received an official letter from the United States military. He'd been drafted. The government was sending him to Vietnam. For many young men of that era, the draft represented a nightmare, an unwanted interruption of their lives for a war most didn't understand in a country they'd never heard of. But Hopper's reaction was different. He saw the draft as an opportunity, a chance to finally prove to his father that he was worth something. If he went to war, if he served his country, if he came back a hero, maybe then his father would look at him with pride instead of disappointment. Maybe then he'd feel like he measured up. It's a heartbreaking motivation, this need to earn love that should have been freely given, and it would colour everything that followed. In 1963, Hopper was sent to Vietnam. Joyce came to see him off, this girl who'd been his friend through all those days of skipping class and stealing cigarettes. She said goodbye to him at Hawkins, not knowing how different he'd be when he returned, not knowing that the boy she'd grown up with would come back fundamentally changed by what he experienced thousands of miles away. As Hopper boarded whatever transport would take him toward the war, we can imagine he felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He was going to be a soldier. He was going to prove himself. He had no idea what he was actually walking into. Into the chemical core. When Hopper arrived in Vietnam in 1963, he stepped off the transport into a wall of humidity unlike anything Indiana had prepared him for. The heat wrapped around him like a wet blanket, oppressive and inescapable, making even breathing feel like work. This was a world away from Hawkins, from Joyce saying goodbye, from his father's disapproving silences. This was war, real and immediate, and 18-year-old Jim Hopper was about to discover exactly what that meant. He went through the standard processing that all new soldiers experienced. Tests to determine aptitude, assessments to figure out where he'd be most useful. The military machine needed to slot everyone into the right position, matching skills to needs, bodies to requirements. Hopper apparently tested well, showing intelligence and capability that got noticed by the officers evaluating him. He wasn't just another grunt with a rifle. He had potential for something more specialised, more technical. Based on these results, he was placed in the Chemical Corps, a specialised unit that dealt with herbicides and defoliants used in the war effort. At the time, this assignment likely seemed like a decent break, perhaps even fortunate compared to other possibilities. Chemical Corps members weren't frontline infantry facing constant combat. They weren't humping through the jungle with 60-pound packs, waiting for gunfire to erupt from any direction. They had important technical work to do, mixing and handling substances used to deny the enemy cover and destroy agricultural resources. While dangerous in its own way and requiring precision and care, it appeared safer than many other assignments young soldiers faced. We can infer that Hopper felt some relief at this placement. The Chemical Corps had a scientific component to it, a technical aspect that required thinking rather than just shooting. For a kid from Hawkins, who'd grown up without much direction or purpose, who'd joined the military partly to prove something to his father, this assignment could have felt like recognition that he had value beyond just being cannon fodder. The military saw something in him, trusted him with important work, gave him a role that mattered. This validation might have been something he'd rarely experienced before. What Hopper and his fellow soldiers didn't know, what nobody told them, what would haunt them for decades, was that they'd been assigned to work with one of the most toxic substances ever created by human beings. They called it Agent Orange, named for the orange striped drums it came stored in, and it would haunt them for the rest of their lives, stealing their health, killing their friends, destroying their children before they were even born. The work itself was deceptively simple, almost mundane in its routine nature. Hopper and his compatriots mixed up 55-gallon drums of Agent Orange, combining chemicals according to specifications handed down from above. They'd pour substances together, stir them until properly combined, seal the drums for transport to aircraft that would spray them across the Vietnamese landscape. It was repetitive work, the kind where you could lose yourself in the rhythm and stop thinking about what you were actually doing or why it mattered. They did this wearing kitchen gloves as their only protection, the kind of cheap rubber gloves you might use washing dishes at home, nothing designed for handling industrial chemicals or protecting against toxic exposure. There were no hazmat suits, no protective gear, no respirators or gas masks. Just these flimsy gloves that provided the illusion of safety while doing absolutely nothing to prevent the chemicals from seeping through, from being absorbed through their skin, from entering their bodies with every moment of contact. Nobody provided proper safety equipment because their superiors assured them there was no danger. The officers said Agent Orange wasn't actually dangerous, wasn't really a weapon, wasn't anything that required serious protection. It was just herbicide, they explained, plant killer. Nothing more harmful than what farmers used on their fields back home. It kills plants, sure, but it's harmless to humans, perfectly safe. Mix it up, boys, and don't worry about a thing. So, Hopper mixed it. Day after day, drum after drum, chemicals soaking through those useless gloves and into his skin, his body accumulating toxins he couldn't see or smell or taste. He trusted the people giving orders, because what else could he do? He was 18 years old, thousands of miles from home, in a war he didn't fully understand. When officers told him something was safe, he believed them. Why wouldn't he? The military wouldn't lie about something so important, would they? They wouldn't deliberately expose their own soldiers to deadly substances while claiming everything was fine, would they? Other times, Hopper and his unit cleaned out what they called buffalo turbines, the mechanical systems that help disperse the chemicals from aircraft during spraying operations. This work was even more dangerous, though nobody told them that either. During these cleanings, they'd be directly exposed to Agent Orange in its gaseous form, the substance floating in the air around them, invisible clouds of poison that they breathed in because nobody provided masks or respirators or any kind of breathing protection. Just inhaling the stuff, Hopper would later recall with bitter understanding, day after day, exposure after exposure. The gas would enter their lungs, get absorbed into their bloodstreams, spread throughout their bodies, their DNA being corrupted by toxins that would express themselves years later in the most devastating ways imaginable. They were being poisoned, slowly and systematically, and they had no idea. They thought they were just doing their jobs, serving their country, following orders. They were actually being destroyed from the inside out. The lie was comprehensive, calculated, institutional. Agent Orange wasn't just herbicide. It wasn't harmless. It wasn't safe. The active ingredients included a substance called 2378 tetrachlorobenzodioxin, a compound so toxic that it's considered one of the most dangerous chemicals ever synthesized by human beings. This wasn't a plant killer. This was a poison that would cause cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, immune system destruction, and countless other health problems that medical science is still cataloguing decades later. The United States military dropped an estimated 19 million gallons of this lethal substance across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia between 1961 and 1971. 19 million gallons of poison, saturating the landscape, destroying ecosystems, seeping into the soil and water, creating environmental devastation that continues to this day. The Vietnamese jungle, targeted for defoliation to deny enemy forces cover, was turned into a poisoned wasteland. Agricultural land was destroyed, leaving communities unable to grow food. Rivers and streams were contaminated, poisoning water supplies. But the real crime, the unforgivable betrayal, was what was done to the soldiers themselves. Young men like Hopper were exposed to this deadly chemical while being told it was harmless. They mixed it, breathed it, absorbed it through their skin, carried it home in their bodies. And then they were sent back to America to start families, to try to build normal lives, to attempt to move on from the war, all while carrying poison in their cells that would manifest in their children. Hopper couldn't see the damage being done to his body as he worked. None of them could. They were just kids mostly, 18 or 19 or 20 years old, doing what they were told, trusting that their government wouldn't lie to them about something so important. Some soldiers even used the empty Agent Orange drums as makeshift showers, convinced there was no risk. The lies were comprehensive, systematic, designed to keep the war machine running regardless of the human cost. And Hopper, along with thousands of others, paid the price for those lies. Beyond the chemical exposure, Vietnam itself was a traumatic experience. Hopper was 8,000 miles from home, a kid from small-town Indiana dropped into a war zone where death could come from anywhere at any time. The heat was oppressive, the jungle hostile, the entire environment designed to break down anyone who entered it. Soldiers formed tight bonds because they needed each other to survive, both physically and mentally. Hopper developed friendships with his fellow Chemical Corps members, men who understood what they were going through because they were going through it together. These friendships would take on tragic significance later. When Hopper eventually returned home, he'd watch as his friends started dying. Cancer would them, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly and agonizingly. Some of them would try to start families only to face heartbreak when their children were born with severe birth defects or didn't survive pregnancy at all. The Agent Orange exposure created a legacy of suffering that extended across generations, destroying not just the soldiers who handled it, but their families as well. Hopper would carry survivors' guilt about this, wondering why he made it when so many others didn't, why he got to come home when some of the best men he knew ended up in early graves. Despite everything, Hopper served with distinction. He became a decorated veteran, earning recognition for his service, receiving medals that signified honor and courage. When he finally returned to America, he came back as a hero in the official narrative, someone who'd done his duty and served his country. But Hopper knew the truth was more complicated. He'd been exposed to poison. He'd been lied to. He'd participated in a war that didn't make sense, fighting for objectives that kept shifting, serving goals that remained unclear. The medals didn't erase what he'd experienced. The recognition didn't heal what was broken inside him. Coming home from Vietnam was supposed to mark the beginning of normal life again. Hopper tried to believe that. He tried to convince himself he could just put the war behind him and move forward. After returning to America as what was officially termed a decorated veteran, Hopper met a woman named Diane. In her, he found something he desperately needed: the possibility of a fresh start, a chance at happiness, a future that didn't include jungle humidity and chemical drums and the screams that sometimes echoed in his nightmares. They fell in love, and in 1972 they married, ready to build a life together. Sara, the brightest light. After returning from Vietnam, Hopper met Diane, and they built a relationship during his attempts to rebuild his life. We know they married in 1972, committing to building a future together, and in April of 1971, before they were officially married, they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Sara. For Hopper, Sara's birth must have felt transformative. He was a father. After everything he'd been through, after all the death and destruction he'd witnessed, he'd helped create life. This tiny, perfect human being was his daughter, and we can imagine that holding her for the first time made him feel like maybe everything he'd survived had been worth it to reach this moment. Sara represented hope, possibility, the chance to be the father his own dad had never been. He could love this little girl unconditionally, protect her from harm, give her the childhood he'd deserved. The Hopper family lived in New York, where they'd moved in 1972 after getting married. Jim worked in the police force there, though his specific assignment in those early years isn't entirely clear from what we know. Diane had persuaded him to leave Hawkins behind, to start fresh somewhere bigger, where the ghosts of his past wouldn't follow quite so closely. They created a life there, navigating the routines of new parenthood with diapers and late-night feedings, and watching Sara grow from infant to toddler to little girl. Based on what we see later, these appear to have been genuinely happy times, when Hopper could look at his family and feel like he'd somehow managed to build something good despite everything. Sara was, by all accounts, a bright, curious child. She had interests in science and space, fascinated by the stars and planets, asking questions about how things worked with that innocent curiosity children possess before the world crushes it out of them. She loved her father fiercely, and he loved her back with an intensity that frightened him sometimes because he couldn't imagine losing her. The bond between them was special, the kind of father-daughter relationship that becomes the foundation of a person's entire sense of self-worth. When Sara was around 3 years old, something happened that, looking back, may have been an early warning sign. The family was at a park, enjoying what seemed like a normal day together, when Sara suddenly started hyperventilating. She couldn't catch her breath, panic setting in as her little lungs struggled to function properly. Hopper tried to help her calm down, breathing slowly with her, trying to get her to match his rhythm, desperate to fix whatever was wrong. They eventually got her breathing under control, but the incident was terrifying for all of them. At the time, it appeared to be an isolated event, a one-time scare that didn't necessarily indicate anything serious. But with what we know now, it's possible this was the first symptom of something much worse developing inside Sara's small body. Not long after the hyperventilating incident, Sara was diagnosed with cancer. That single word, spoken by doctors in a sterile medical office, detonated in the Hopper family like a bomb. Cancer. Their beautiful, vibrant daughter. This little girl who asked questions about stars and loved playing outside and had a whole life ahead of her, had cancer growing inside her small body. She was maybe 3 or 4 years old, an age when kids should be worried about nothing more serious than which toys to play with or what's for dinner. Instead, Sara faced a battle that most adults would struggle to survive. The specifics of her cancer type aren't fully detailed in the available information, but it was serious enough to require intensive treatment, aggressive enough to steal her childhood, frightening enough to consume her parents' entire existence. Doctors laid out treatment plans involving chemotherapy, that brutal poison-to-cure poison approach that attacks everything in a desperate attempt to kill cancer cells faster than healthy ones. Sara, barely old enough to understand what was happening to her, was about to endure one of the most grueling medical treatments human medicine has devised. Sara began chemotherapy, and the side effects were immediate and devastating. Her hair started falling out, that thick child's hair disappearing in clumps until she was completely bald. For a little girl, losing your hair is traumatic in ways that go beyond the physical. It marks you as sick, makes your illness visible to everyone, strips away a part of your identity. Sara looked in the mirror and saw a different version of herself, a sick version, a version whose appearance screamed that something was very wrong. Shrey became permanently hospitalized as her condition worsened, too sick to go home, too weak to be anywhere except under constant medical supervision. The hospital became her entire world, with its sterile smell and beeping machines and sympathetic nurses who tried to make her comfortable, but couldn't actually fix what was wrong. The halls with their fluorescent lights, the uncomfortable beds, the IV poles and monitoring equipment. This became Sara's reality, day after day, week after week, month after month. Hopper and Diane essentially moved into the hospital alongside their daughter. They maintained whatever minimal presence at home and work was absolutely necessary, but their real life happened in that hospital room. Every parent's nightmare is watching their child suffer and being helpless to stop it. and the Hoppers lived that nightmare every single day. They watched Sara undergo treatments that made her violently ill. They held her hand during procedures that terrified her. They tried to maintain hope while seeing their daughter fade away before their eyes. Hopper was there constantly, as much as the hospital would allow, and then some. He couldn't save Sara from this. He couldn't fight this enemy. He couldn't protect his daughter from the disease ravaging her body from the inside out. But he could be present. He could sit beside her bed. He could hold her hand. He could make sure she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. We know from what we see later that he read to her for hours, his voice becoming the soundtrack to her hospital existence. One of the books he read was Anne of Green Gables, that classic story of an imaginative orphan girl finding her place in the world. We can picture Hopper sitting in that uncomfortable hospital chair, opening the book and letting the words transport them both away from the reality of her condition. For those moments while he read aloud, they could escape into Anne's world of Green Gables and kindred spirits and the beauty of Prince Edward Island. They could pretend Sara was just a normal kid listening to a bedtime story rather than a cancer patient fighting for her life. Sara would listen, her small bold head on the pillow, her body weak from treatment, her eyes focused on her father's face as he read. These were precious moments for both of them, times when the cancer receded into the background and they could just be father and daughter sharing a story. Hopper put everything he had into those reading sessions, doing different voices for characters, making Sara smile when she could, providing whatever small comfort stories could offer in the face of such enormous suffering. But when Sara was resting or sleeping, when Hopper didn't have to be strong for her anymore, when the mask of parental courage could finally slip, we see in flashbacks that he'd leave the room and find somewhere private to fall apart. The stairwell became his refuge, that concrete space between floors where he could go to cry alone. Based on what we witness in these flashback moments, he'd sink down overwhelmed by grief, letting the fear and helplessness pour out where Sara couldn't see. The agony of watching his daughter die was unbearable. The knowledge that there was nothing he could do to save her, that all his strength and determination and love couldn't change her diagnosis, crushed him. He was her father. He was supposed to protect her from everything. That was the job, the fundamental responsibility of being a parent. Keep your child safe. Shield them from harm. Make sure nothing bad happens to them. And he was failing at the most basic level imaginable. Hopper would cry in that stairwell, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't share with Sara, because she needed him to be strong. Then he'd compose himself, wipe his eyes, put the smile back on his face, and return to her bedside like everything was fine. The performance exhausted him, maintaining that facade of hope, while feeling utterly hopeless inside. But Sara needed him to believe she might survive this. So he pretended, hour after hour, day after day, even as he watched her condition deteriorate. Diane was there too, of course, sharing the vigil, watching their daughter fade away. She and Hopper supported each other as much as two broken people possibly could, taking turns being strong when the other couldn't manage it, spelling each other for brief breaks, united in their love for Sara, even as the stress of her illness put impossible strain on their marriage. The hospital room became the centre of their entire universe. Work didn't matter. Friends didn't matter. Their relationship with each other barely mattered. Nothing existed except Sara and her fight and their desperate hope that somehow she might win. The medical team did everything they could. They adjusted treatment protocols. They managed symptoms. They provided whatever palliative care would ease Sara's suffering. But ultimately, cancer is a brutal opponent, and paediatric cancer especially so. Children's bodies aren't designed to handle the aggressive treatments required to fight it. The cure itself can cause enormous damage even when it works. When it doesn't work, when the cancer proves too aggressive, or too resistant, or just too much, there's nothing medicine can do except make the end as comfortable as possible. By 1979, when Sara was 7 years old, the cancer had consumed too much. Her heart stopped. The doctors surrounded her bed, attempting CPR, trying to restart what had given out. Machines flatlined. The medical team worked frantically while Diane and Hopper could only watch in horror, witnessing their daughter's final moments, seeing the end come despite everyone's desperate efforts to prevent it. Sara's heart monitor went flat, that terrible continuous tone replacing the rhythmic beeping that had marked her continued existence. She was gone. Hopper held his sobbing wife as Sara passed away, both of them destroyed by the magnitude of what they'd just lost. Their daughter was dead at 7 years old. The bright, curious, beloved little girl who'd asked questions about stars and loved Anne of Green Gables and trusted her parents to keep her safe had been taken by a disease nobody could fight. The hole Sara left behind was absolute, a void that would define the rest of Hopper's life. In the aftermath of Sara's death, Hopper came to believe something that transformed his grief into crushing guilt. He learned that many of his fellow Chemical Corps members were experiencing similar tragedies with their children. Kids were being born with birth defects. Some pregnancies ended in stillbirth. The children who survived often developed cancer, just like Sara. The pattern suggested a connection to the Agent Orange exposure, and Hopper became convinced that the chemicals he'd mixed with kitchen gloves, the toxins he'd breathed in without a mask, had poisoned him in ways that expressed themselves in Sara's cells. According to what Hopper himself believes, he had known even before Sara was born that there might be risks from his Vietnam service. He and his fellow veterans had been trying to return to normal life after the war, but things kept going wrong with their children. Despite being aware of potential dangers, Hopper had chosen to have a child anyway, hoping everything would be fine. When Sara developed cancer, he saw it as confirmation that his choice had killed her. The Agent Orange had corrupted his DNA, and Sara paid the ultimate price for his decision to become a father. "I am the curse," Hopper would later say, and he meant it literally. He wasn't someone suffering under a curse. He was the curse itself, a walking source of contamination that destroyed everyone he touched. His presence had killed his daughter as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. That's what Hopper believed, and that belief would poison every relationship he attempted afterward, because how could he let anyone close when closeness meant destruction? The guilt was unbearable, the grief was bottomless, and Hopper's marriage, already strained by Sara's illness and death, couldn't survive what came after. Diane and Hopper divorced. The 7 years they'd been together, which Hopper would later describe as everything to me, ended in separation. Diane eventually remarried and had another child, moving forward with her life in whatever way she could. Hopper, meanwhile, fell apart. He began drinking heavily, using alcohol to numb the pain that threatened to swallow him whole. He started taking pills, anti-anxiety medication that created a haze he could hide in. The combination of alcohol and pharmaceuticals became his constant companion, his method of surviving each day without the agony becoming too much to bear. Hopper wasn't trying to die exactly, but he wasn't really trying to live either. He existed in a grey space between the two, going through motions, maintaining appearances, slowly drowning in substances and sorrow. New York. The detective. Years after Sara's death and his divorce from Diane, Hopper remained in New York and threw himself deeper into police work. He'd been working in the police force there since the family moved in 1972. But following the tragedies that destroyed his family, his role appears to have evolved or intensified. By 1977, we know for certain that Hopper was working as a homicide detective in Manhattan, dealing with the worst crimes humanity had to offer. The city in that era was a pressure cooker of crime, violence, and urban decay. For someone wanting to lose himself in work, wanting to stay too busy to think about what he'd lost, it was the perfect environment. Murders, bodies, grieving families, cases that required him to wade through the darkest aspects of human nature. It was grim work, the kind that ate at your soul if you let it. But based on his later struggles, Hopper likely didn't care much about protecting his soul anymore. He carried the weight of Sara's death, and in comparison, everything else seemed almost trivial. The canonical tie-in novel, Stranger Things, Darkness on the Edge of Town, provides additional details about this period of Hopper's life. The book is framed around Hopper and Eleven sharing their first Christmas together after Season 2, with Eleven finding boxes of his old possessions and asking questions that lead to stories about his past. Through this narrative device, we learn about specific cases Hopper worked and the darkness he encountered in the city during those years. One significant event, detailed in the novel, involved a city-wide blackout orchestrated by a villain named St. John, who had plans to take over New York during the chaos. According to this story, Hopper played an instrumental role in stopping this plot, restoring order and taking St. John down. While this specific case comes from expanded universe material rather than the show itself, it illustrates the type of high-stakes work Hopper handled during his detective years, and suggests why he developed such strong investigative instincts. Throughout his detective years, Sara remained Hopper's primary motivation, even in death. He carried her memory with him, the blue hair ribbon from her hospital stays wrapped around his wrist as a constant reminder. He'd look at crime scenes and think of her. He'd interview grieving parents and see his own pain reflected back at him. The work gave him purpose in the absence of everything else, a reason to get up each morning beyond just the need to find more pills and whiskey. Hopper proved himself a skilled detective during these years, capable of excellent police work when he focused. He knew how to read crime scenes, conduct interviews, follow leads, build cases. His experience in Vietnam had given him certain skills that translated well to detective work. He understood violence, knew how to handle weapons, could keep his head in dangerous situations. But he was also drinking too much and popping pills to handle his anxiety, a combination that would eventually become unsustainable. The city weighed on him. All those strangers needing help, all those crimes demanding justice, all that suffering that never stopped. Hopper mentioned later that he was mostly involved with strangers during his New York years, investigating murders of people he didn't know, grieving with families he'd never see again. It was impersonal work in some ways, which might have been why he could do it. Losing Sara had wrecked him. Investing emotionally in anyone else felt impossible. Better to keep people at arm's length, to remain professional, to not let himself care too much about anyone. But the combination of grief, guilt, substance abuse, and the grinding nature of homicide work created an untenable situation. Hopper was self-destructing, slowly but surely burning out under the weight of everything he carried. He needed an escape, a way out, a chance to stop running from his past by drowning himself in other people's tragedies. Eventually, he made the decision to leave New York behind. The boxes marked New York and Vietnam that Eleven would later discover in Hopper's cabin held mementos from these periods of his life. We don't know exactly what's inside them, but they represent chapters he'd tried to close, histories he'd attempted to bury. The fact that he kept them at all suggests he couldn't fully let go, couldn't completely disconnect from who he'd been, even as he tried to become someone else. Hopper's time as a New York homicide detective shaped him in fundamental ways. He learned to compartmentalize, to function despite overwhelming internal pain, to maintain a facade of competence even when everything inside was chaos. These skills would serve him when he eventually returned to Hawkins and faced supernatural threats, but they also represented a kind of damage that would take years to begin healing. The detective who left New York was thoroughly broken, convinced he was cursed, certain that letting anyone close would only lead to more suffering. Coming home broken, sometime around 1979, based on the timeline of events we know, Hopper returned to Hawkins, Indiana. He'd left as an 18-year-old kid, eager to prove himself, ready to take on the world. He came back as a haunted man in his 30s, carrying more trauma than anyone should have to bear. The small town that had felt suffocating in his youth now offered something he desperately needed. Obscurity, quiet, a place where the pace was slow enough that maybe he could finally catch his breath. He became the chief of police in Hawkins, a position that sounds impressive, but mostly involved dealing with trivial issues in a town where nothing serious ever happened. This was perfect for Hopper in his current state. He didn't want real police work, didn't want cases that mattered, didn't want responsibility that might lead to more failure. Missing garden gnomes and noise complaints and the occasional drunk driver represented the ideal level of professional engagement. Low stakes, minimal effort, nothing that could hurt him if he screwed it up. The worst thing Hopper encountered in his first 4 years as Hawkins' chief of police was an owl attacking a local resident's head because it thought her hair was a nest. That anecdote, which he'd share later, perfectly encapsulated the sleepy nature of Hawkins' law enforcement. This wasn't New York, with its murders and violence and constant threat. This was small-town America, where owls represented the height of danger, and danger itself was mostly non-existent. Hopper settled into a trailer home, living alone, maintaining the bare minimum of existence. He continued drinking, continued taking pills, continued using substances to create distance between himself and his feelings. His colleagues at the police department knew him as competent enough, but checked out, someone going through the motions without real investment. When he came into the station at the start of November 1983, the biggest issue anyone brought to his attention was missing garden gnomes. That was the job, and that's exactly what Hopper wanted it to be. He was sleeping with his secretary at one point, a casual physical relationship that didn't demand emotional vulnerability. He maintained surface-level friendships with his officers, particularly Powell and Callahan, but didn't let anyone really close. Joyce Byers was still in town, his old high school friend, who'd said goodbye to him before Vietnam, but they'd drifted apart over the years. She'd married Lonnie and had 2 sons, and was dealing with her own struggles. Hopper existed on the periphery of the community, present but not really engaged, there but not really alive. The pills and alcohol had become routine, his method of making it through each day. He'd wake up in the trailer, reach for medication before breakfast, head to work with a hangover, push through the day's minimal demands, then go home to drink some more. It was a cycle of numbing himself, of maintaining the emotional distance he needed to function. Hopper wasn't actively trying to die, but he wasn't really trying to live either. He was just existing, day after day, going through the motions, because that's what you did when you couldn't think of a better alternative. People who knew Hopper during this period, like Joyce, could see he wasn't okay. The charismatic kid who'd skipped class and charmed everyone was gone, replaced by this bitter, exhausted man who chain-smoked and drank too much, and seemed to resent any disruption to his quiet misery. But Hawkins wasn't the kind of place where people pushed too hard into other people's business. If Hopper wanted to drink himself into oblivion while solving the Great Garden Gnome mystery, that was his prerogative. His relationship with his ex-wife Diane had evolved into something civil but distant. She'd remarried by this point, had another child, moved on with her life. They'd speak occasionally, usually about nothing important, dancing around the elephant in the room that was Sara's absence. In one call Hopper made to Diane, he told her that those 7 years together were everything to him, a rare moment of vulnerability that revealed just how much he'd lost when their marriage dissolved. She asked if he'd been drinking again, the kind of question that suggested this was an ongoing concern, that his substance use was known and worrying. Hopper mentioned having a friend at the Times during this period, potentially referring to the New York Times, a connection to his detective days that he apparently maintained even after leaving the city. But mostly, he'd severed ties with his past, storing it away in boxes under floorboards and trying not to think about who he used to be or what he'd lost. The man who would eventually become a hero, who would save kids from monsters and adopt a daughter with supernatural powers, seemed impossibly far away from the guy slouching behind the desk in Hawkins Police Department in November of 1983. That man was buried under trauma and pills and alcohol, convinced he was cursed, certain that he'd destroyed everyone he'd ever loved. It would take something extraordinary to wake him up, to remind him that he still had the capacity to care, to fight, to protect. That extraordinary thing arrived when Joyce Byers walked into his office and told him her son had disappeared. Will's disappearance, a purpose reborn. On November 6, 1983, 12-year-old Will Byers vanished without a trace. One moment he was riding his bike home from a game of Dungeons and Dragons at Mike Wheeler's house, a normal kid doing normal things on a normal night. The next moment he was gone, disappeared into the darkness as if he'd never existed. His abandoned bike was found on the side of the road, but Will himself had simply vanished. His mother Joyce knew immediately, instinctively, that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a boy being late, or staying at a friend's house without permission, or any of the normal things that might explain a kid not coming home when expected. This was different. This was dangerous. Joyce could feel it in her bones, that mother's intuition that screams when your child is in genuine peril. She needed help, needed someone to take her seriously, needed law enforcement to act immediately, because every moment Will was missing was a moment he could be hurt or worse. She went to the Hawkins Police Department, seeking that help, and there she encountered Jim Hopper, the chief who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything else than dealing with actual police work. Hopper in November of 1983 was not an impressive figure. He was hungover more often than not, looked perpetually exhausted, chain-smoked his way through every conversation, and radiated the kind of cynical disinterest that comes from having checked out of life emotionally years ago. He was a man who'd perfected the art of going through motions without actually being present. Hopper's initial reaction to Joyce's report wasn't particularly encouraging or impressive. He was dismissive in that way small-town cops often are when confronted with what seems like an overreaction. Kids don't just disappear in Hawkins. Nothing bad happens here. The boy probably went to a friend's house and forgot to call. Maybe he's still at Mike's. Maybe he decided to sleep in the fort the boys built in the woods. There's probably a perfectly innocent explanation, Mrs. Byers, and you're getting worked up over nothing. Go home, get some rest, and Will turn up tomorrow feeling foolish for worrying you. It was standard small-town police chief behaviour, the kind of response designed to calm down a worried parent, rather than immediately launch into crisis mode. Hopper had handled countless similar calls over his years as chief. Parents convinced their kid was missing who turned up at a friend's house or hiding in their own backyard playing some game. The vast majority of these situations resolved themselves without requiring any real police work. So his initial instinct was to downplay Joyce's concerns, to suggest patience, to wait and see before taking any dramatic action. But Joyce was insistent in a way that got through even Hopper's armour of disinterest. Something was wrong. Her son was missing, truly missing, not just late or being irresponsible. She needed help finding him, needed it immediately, needed someone to take her seriously and act like this mattered. The desperation in her voice, the fear in her eyes, the absolute certainty that Will was in danger triggered something in Hopper that he'd thought was long dead. Actual concern about someone else's pain. Joyce told him about the phone call she'd received, the static and breathing on the other end that she believed was Will trying to communicate. Most people would have dismissed this as wishful thinking or grief-induced delusion, but Hopper went to Joyce's house to investigate. He examined the phone that had been charred by an electrical surge so powerful it had burned the plastic. Joyce was right that this was unusual, that something strange had happened. The evidence didn't support a simple runaway scenario or a kid spending the night with a friend. Something genuinely weird was going on. For most of the town, Will's disappearance would eventually be explained away through official channels that seemed to close the case. A body was found in the quarry, pulled from the water and identified as the missing boy. The medical examiner confirmed it, the police documented it. A funeral was held where the entire community came to mourn this tragic loss. Will Byers was dead, drowned in the quarry, case closed. The town could mourn and move forward, secure in the knowledge that this sad story had reached its sad conclusion. But Hopper couldn't accept that narrative. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, didn't line up properly. Triggered instincts he'd developed during his years working homicide in New York. The details felt wrong. The timing felt suspicious. The whole thing felt manufactured, like someone was trying too hard to create a neat resolution to a case that was anything but neat. His detective skills, dormant for years in the placid environment of Hawkins, suddenly woke up and started asking uncomfortable questions. He made a decision that demonstrated he still had fight left in him, still had the capacity to act when action mattered. He went to the morgue where Will's supposed body was being kept, and he broke in to examine the corpse himself. This was illegal, obviously. This was a violation of protocols and procedures. This could cost him his job if anyone found out. But Hopper did it anyway, because the need to know the truth overrode his usual caution and checked-out apathy. What he found inside that body bag changed everything. He didn't find a child's remains. He didn't find Will Byers' body. He found a crude dummy, stuffed with cotton, designed to look vaguely like a human form under cursory examination, but obviously fake upon close inspection. This wasn't Will, this was a prop, a fabrication meant to convince everyone that the missing boy was dead and prevent anyone from looking further. The conspiracy ran deeper than missing children and official explanations. Someone was actively covering something up, willing to fake a child's death to stop the investigation. This discovery ignited something in Hopper that had been dormant for years. Suddenly, he wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was engaged, focused, determined to uncover the truth regardless of where it led or who tried to stop him. This was real police work, the kind that mattered, the kind that could save a life if he was good enough and fast enough and smart enough. For the first time since Sara died, Hopper had a purpose beyond just surviving to the next day. As Hopper investigated, he discovered Hawkins National Laboratory was at the centre of everything, This mysterious government facility had been conducting experiments, had accidentally opened a gate to an alternate dimension called the Upside Down, and was now covering up the consequences. Will Byers hadn't run away or drowned. He'd been taken into this other dimension by a creature called the Demogorgon, and he was still alive, barely trapped in a nightmare world, while everyone in Hawkins believed him dead. The investigation brought Hopper and Joyce back together as a team. They needed each other to navigate the conspiracy, to deal with government agents trying to silence them, to find a way to rescue Will before it was too late. Through this process, something in Hopper began to shift. He was engaging with the world again, actually caring about an outcome, fighting for something beyond his own survival. The pills and alcohol were still there, but so was a purpose he hadn't felt since Sara died. One of the most significant moments in Hopper's reawakening came when Joyce had an anxiety attack upon seeing Will in peril in the Upside Down. Hopper was there for her, helping her through the panic, supporting her when she needed it most. It mirrored his own experience with Sara when she'd hyperventilated in the park all those years ago. Hopper understood what Joyce was going through because he'd lived it, and that shared understanding created a bond between them that would only deepen over time. During the investigation, Hopper also encountered 11, a young girl with psychokinetic abilities who'd escaped from Hawkins' lab. She had been the one to accidentally open the gate to the Upside Down, though it wasn't her fault. She was a victim of the same government conspiracy that had put Will in danger. Hopper saw in 11 another kid who needed protection, someone vulnerable who deserved a chance at safety and normalcy. When the final confrontation came, Hopper and Joyce were permitted to enter the Upside Down itself to search for Will. They found him there, barely clinging to life, his body failing from the toxic environment. Hopper performed CPR, breathing life back into this child who wasn't his, but who mattered anyway, refusing to let another kid die if he could prevent it. And amazingly, it worked. Will survived. They brought him back to the normal world, returned him to his family, saved him from a fate worse than death. For Hopper, saving Will was transformative. He'd failed to save Sara. He'd been helpless as cancer took his daughter away. But here, in this insane situation involving alternate dimensions and government conspiracies and supernatural monsters, he'd actually made a difference. He'd saved a child's life. That success didn't erase his failures, but it reminded him that he still had value, still had purpose, still had the capacity to protect people who needed protecting. After 11's apparent death in the fight against the Demogorgon, Hopper did something revealing. He left food in the woods, including Eggo waffles, 11's favourite. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't make a show of it. But he suspected, or hoped, that she might still be alive somewhere, and he wanted her to know someone was looking out for her. It was an act of faith, of caring, that the broken man from the trailer wouldn't have been capable of at the start of November. The investigation into Will's disappearance had cracked Hopper's shell, forced him to engage with life again, reminded him what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. He was far from healed. The trauma and guilt hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. A tiny spark of purpose had reignited in the darkness. That spark would grow into a flame as Hopper took on the most important role he'd had since Sara died, becoming a father again. Becoming a father again. In the months following Will's rescue and 11's apparent sacrifice, Hopper discovered something extraordinary. 11 was alive. She'd escaped the Upside Down, was hiding in the woods, surviving on whatever she could scavenge. Hopper found her and made a decision that would change both of their lives. He decided to take her in, to provide shelter and protection, to give this scared, powerful girl chance at something resembling a normal life. Hopper's cabin became Eleven's home. He set up rules to keep her hidden from the government agents who were still looking for her. She couldn't leave the cabin. She couldn't let anyone know she was alive. She had to stay quiet and out of sight while Hopper figured out how to keep her safe long term. It wasn't an ideal situation for a young girl who'd spent most of her life locked in a laboratory, but it was better than being hunted or recaptured. The relationship between Hopper and Eleven started rocky. He was emotionally closed off, unprepared for the demands of parenting, trying to protect her while maintaining distance because letting himself care felt dangerous. Eleven was starved for connection, desperate for freedom, frustrated by the limitations Hopper imposed even when they were for her safety. They clashed frequently throughout the time they spent in the cabin together. Hopper forbade Eleven from leaving or contacting anyone, especially Mike, the boy she'd developed feelings for before her disappearance. This isolation was necessary for her safety, but terrible for her mental health. When Hopper cut the wires to the television set, removing one of her few connections to the outside world, their relationship reached a breaking point. Eleven discovered the boxes marked New York, Vietnam, and Hawkins lab hidden beneath the floorboards, physical evidence of the past Hopper kept locked away. She ran away, seeking her mother, and eventually finding another Hawkins lab survivor named Coley, who taught her how to maximize her powers. But even during Eleven's absence, something important was happening. Hopper was learning to be vulnerable again. He was learning that pushing people away to protect them wasn't actually protecting anyone. When Eleven returned to help close the gate to the Upside Down, Hopper was there with her, trusting her, working alongside her as a partner rather than just someone to be controlled and kept safe. The moment of deepest connection between Hopper and Eleven came during the drive to Hawkins' lab for their final mission to close the gate. Hopper told her about Sara, opening up about his daughter's death in a way he rarely did with anyone. It was an act of trust and vulnerability, letting Eleven see his pain, letting her understand why he'd been so overprotective. Eleven listened, and in that conversation they moved from guardian and ward to something more like actual father and daughter. After they successfully closed the gate together, Hopper took an even bigger step. He made arrangements with Dr. Sam Owens, one of the more ethical people associated with Hawkins' lab, to obtain forged adoption papers. The birth certificate listed Eleven's legal name as Jane Hopper, effectively making her his daughter in the eyes of the law. It was official now. He wasn't just harbouring a fugitive or protecting someone temporarily. He was her father, and she was his daughter. The symbolism of giving Eleven Sara's blue hair ribbon cannot be overstated. Hopper had worn that ribbon on his wrist for years, a constant reminder of the daughter he'd lost. Giving it to Eleven wasn't about replacing Sara or forgetting her. It was about carrying Sara's memory forward, about honouring his late daughter by protecting this one, about allowing himself to love again despite the risk of loss. When Eleven wore that ribbon to the snowball dance, she was wearing a piece of Hopper's heart, a symbol that they were family now. The transition to official fatherhood wasn't always smooth. In Season 3, with Eleven now able to leave the cabin and interact with the world, Hopper struggled with normal parenting challenges that his trauma and guilt complicated. Eleven started dating Mike, spending all her time with him, doing typical teenage things, and Hopper reacted poorly. His protectiveness manifested as jealousy and controlling behaviour. He tried to deliver a heart-to-heart speech he'd written about his feelings, but it backfired, and he ended up threatening Mike to stay away from Eleven instead. This period represented Hopper at his most difficult as a parent. He was afraid of losing Eleven, afraid of her growing up and not needing him anymore, afraid that letting her be independent would somehow lead to disaster. His behaviour became overbearing to the point that it strained their relationship, but underneath the jealousy and poor communication was love, genuine care for this girl who'd become his daughter. The letter Hopper wrote, the heart-to-heart he couldn't deliver properly, revealed the depth of his transformation. He wrote about being afraid to watch 11 grow up, about wanting to keep her safe, about acknowledging that change was necessary and healthy even when it scared him. He wrote about life moving forward, about trusting her to make good choices, about being proud of who she was becoming. It was the letter of a father learning to let go while still holding on, terrified of loss, but trying to be brave enough to allow love anyway. When Hopper apparently died at the end of season 3, sacrificing himself to help Joyce close the gate and stop the Russian threat, 11 was devastated. She'd lost another father, another person who had protected her and cared for her. Joyce gave her the letter Hopper had written, and reading his words became one of the most emotional moments in the entire series. 11 cried as she heard Hopper's voice in her head, processing his love and fear and hope for her future. Of course, Hopper wasn't actually dead. He'd survived the explosion, been captured by Russians, and sent to a prison camp in Kamchatka. During his captivity, isolated and suffering, Hopper finally articulated something he'd been feeling for years. "I wasn't cursed. I am the curse." He believed that letting people into his life endangered them, that he destroyed everyone he touched. But he also realised how wrong he'd been to push Joyce and 11 away. They didn't need him, he reflected. He needed them. When Hopper and 11 finally reunited after his escape from Russia, it was one of the most powerful moments in Stranger Things. This broken man, who'd convinced himself he was poison, had proven through his journey with 11 that he still had the capacity to be a good father, to protect without suffocating, to love without destroying. 11 had saved him as much as he'd saved her. By allowing himself to be her dad, by opening his heart despite the risk, Hopper had begun healing wounds he'd carried since Sara died. Finding love again. Throughout his journey of learning to be a father again, Hopper was also slowly, reluctantly, opening himself to the possibility of romantic love. The object of this potential love was the same person who'd been there since the beginning. Joyce Byers, his old friend from Hawkins High. The woman who'd said goodbye to him before Vietnam. The mother who'd fought alongside him to save Will. Joyce and Hopper's relationship had always contained layers of unspoken feeling. They knew each other better than most people in Hawkins knew anyone. They had shared cigarettes as teenagers, faced down government conspiracies as adults, supported each other through unimaginable circumstances. There was history between them, chemistry, a foundation of trust and understanding that made a romantic relationship seem almost inevitable. But timing and circumstances kept getting in the way. During season 2, Joyce was dating Bob Newby, good old Bob the Brain from high school, who'd grown up to run the local radio shack. Bob was kind, enthusiastic, genuinely devoted to Joyce and her sons. He was a good man, and Joyce cared about him deeply. Hopper respected that, maintained his distance, focused on his relationship with 11 rather than pursuing anything with Joyce. When Hopper got trapped in the Upside Down during the events of season 2, Joyce rushed to save him with help from Will and Bob. The moment she pulled Hopper out of danger, her first reaction was to embrace him tightly, holding on with an intensity that made Bob stand there awkwardly. It was clear to everyone, including Bob, that Joyce's feelings for Hopper ran deeper than she might have admitted, but Bob was understanding, secure enough not to feel threatened, and the moment passed without confrontation. Tragically, Bob died during the season 2 climax, killed by demodogs while helping Joyce and the others escape. His death devastated Joyce, who genuinely cared for him and now had to process losing another person she loved. Hopper was there for her during the grieving process, but he also recognised that Joyce needed time and space to heal. Starting something romantic immediately after Bob's death would have been inappropriate, disrespectful to Bob's memory and Joyce's grief. By season 3, enough time had passed that Hopper felt ready to try expressing his feelings. He attempted to ask Joyce out, but he was terrible at it. Years of emotional repression and substance abuse had destroyed whatever charm he'd possessed as a teenager. He was awkward, unclear, unable to just say what he meant. Joyce didn't realise he was asking her on a date, leading to miscommunication and frustration on both sides. Eventually, Hopper managed to invite Joyce to Enzo's, a nice Italian restaurant, for what was clearly supposed to be a romantic dinner. He even wrote out a speech about his feelings, preparing to finally be vulnerable and honest with her. But Joyce stood him up, not because she didn't care, but because she'd discovered strange magnetic anomalies and was investigating with Scott Clark, the science teacher. Hopper, finding out Joyce had been with another man, became jealous and hurt, his insecurity manifesting as anger. This period represented Hopper at his most emotionally immature. He was trying to pursue Joyce while simultaneously being terrible at communication, jealous without cause, controlling in his behaviour. His issues from Sara's death and his failed marriage to Diane were affecting his ability to have a healthy romantic relationship. He wanted love, but was terrified of it, approaching Joyce with one hand extended while the other pushed her away. Despite the awkwardness and miscommunication, Joyce and Hopper worked together throughout season 3 to uncover the Russian conspiracy, to close the gate to the Upside Down that had been reopened beneath Starcourt Mall. They fought side by side, trusted each other with their lives, demonstrated the kind of partnership that goes beyond surface-level attraction. When Hopper seemingly died in the explosion that closed the gate, Joyce was the one who had to watch it happen, unable to save him, forced to accept that he was gone. Hopper's apparent death left Joyce devastated. She'd lost Bob, and now she'd lost Hopper too, before they'd ever really had a chance to explore what they meant to each other. She took in 11 as part of her family, moved away from Hawkins to Lenora Hills, California, trying to start over somewhere that didn't remind her constantly of everyone she'd lost. When Joyce learned that Hopper was actually alive, imprisoned in Russia, she didn't hesitate. She mortgaged her house, gathered money however she could, and went to rescue him. This decision put her own life at risk, cost her everything she'd built in her attempt to move forward, but she did it anyway because Hopper mattered that much to her. Love meant showing up, fighting, refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. The reunion between Joyce and Hopper in the Russian prison was awkward at first, both of them unsure how to bridge the time and distance and pain that had separated them. But then, in the middle of this nightmare situation with no clear way out, they finally stopped fighting their feelings. They kissed, admitted they cared about each other, allowed themselves to be vulnerable in a way neither had managed before. It was passionate and messy and imperfect, but it was real. After escaping Russia and returning to Hawkins, Joyce and Hopper were finally together, officially a couple. No more dancing around their feelings or letting fear prevent connection. They held hands as they surveyed the damage to their town, ready to face whatever came next as partners. After years of near misses and bad timing and emotional barriers, they had found their way to each other. For Hopper, falling in love with Joyce represented the final piece of his healing. He'd learned to be a father again, with 11. Now he was learning to be a partner, to let someone in completely, to trust that loving someone didn't automatically doom them. Joyce knew his past, understood his pain, and loved him anyway. She had proven through her actions that she was willing to fight for him, to risk everything for him, to see him as more than the curse he'd believed himself to be. The relationship between Hopper and Joyce offered hope, demonstrated that even people carrying enormous trauma could find connection, that second chances were possible, that love could heal what seemed permanently broken. Their romance wasn't a replacement for what they'd lost. Bob would always be part of Joyce's story. Sara and Diane would always be part of Hopper's. But those losses didn't prevent new love from growing. They'd both been through hell, separately and together, and they'd chosen each other anyway. The redemption arc complete. Looking at where Hopper started and where he ended up reveals a transformation that's rare in fiction and even rarer in real life. The man we first met was barely functional, destroyed by grief and guilt, convinced he was cursed, using substances to numb himself, going through motions without purpose. The man who reunited with Eleven and Joyce after escaping Russian prison was fundamentally different. Someone who'd learned to open his heart again, to fight for people he loved, to believe he deserved connection and happiness. Hopper's redemption wasn't about becoming perfect. He still had flaws, still made mistakes, still struggled with communication and vulnerability. His behaviour in Season 3 demonstrated that healing isn't linear, that progress comes with setbacks. But the overall trajectory was clear. This was someone learning to be human again after years of barely surviving. The key to Hopper's transformation was his willingness to let people in despite his fear. Every relationship he rebuilt required him to risk the pain of loss again. Taking in 11 meant accepting that he might fail another daughter, that loving her could lead to more devastation. Pursuing Joyce meant opening himself to romantic vulnerability with someone who could hurt him. Each connection he formed was an act of courage, a choice to believe that love was worth the risk, even when his experience suggested otherwise. Sara's death would always be the defining tragedy of Hopper's life. Nothing could change that. Nothing could bring her back or erase the pain of losing her. But through 11, Hopper learned that loving another daughter didn't dishonour Sara's memory. Through Joyce, he learned that moving forward romantically didn't mean forgetting Diane. Through his work protecting Hawkins, he learned that his actions could matter even if he couldn't save everyone. The symbolism of the blue hair ribbon perfectly encapsulates this journey. Hopper wore Sara's ribbon for years as a reminder of what he'd lost, a physical manifestation of his grief. When he gave it to 11, he wasn't letting go of Sara. He was carrying her forward, honouring her by protecting another girl who needed a father, allowing Sara's memory to live through his love for 11 rather than through his guilt and isolation. Hopper's military service, particularly his exposure to Agent Orange and his resulting belief that he caused Sara's cancer, created a specific type of trauma that many veterans struggle with. The betrayal of learning that his government had lied to him, had exposed him to deadly toxins while claiming they were harmless, had created a generation of sick veterans and damaged children, was profound. The guilt of believing he'd poisoned his own daughter was almost unbearable. His journey involved learning that he wasn't to blame for what happened to Sara, that the real culprits were the systems that lied about Agent Orange's dangers, that surviving when others wasn't a moral failing. This aspect of Hopper's story brings important attention to the ongoing impact of Agent Orange on veterans and their families. The show's decision to explicitly connect Sara's death to Hopper's Vietnam service wasn't just character development. It was a way of honouring the real veterans who've suffered similar tragedies, whose children and grandchildren continue dealing with health issues linked to toxic exposure. Hopper's pain is fictional, but it represents very real trauma experienced by thousands of families. The transformation of Hopper from broken veteran to protective father to loving partner demonstrates that redemption is possible even after profound loss. He didn't need to get over Sara's death or forget his trauma. He needed to learn to carry his past while still moving forward, to honour what he'd lost while building something new, to accept that being hurt didn't mean he was broken beyond repair. When Hopper told Dmitri Antonov, his Russian prison friend, about his history, he articulated the core of his struggle. "I wasn't cursed, I am the curse." But by the end of his journey, Hopper was learning a different truth. He wasn't cursed or a curse. He was a man who'd suffered enormously, who'd survived when survival seemed impossible, who'd found the courage to love again despite every reason not to. That's not a curse. That's heroism of the quietest, most important kind. The full scope of Hopper's redemption becomes clear when we consider what he's built by the end of Season 4. He has a daughter in 11 who loves him and whom he loves fiercely. He has a romantic partner in Joyce who knows his worst moments and chooses him anyway. He has the respect of the young people he's protected, who see him as a hero even when he doesn't see himself that way. He's reconnected with his capacity for bravery, loyalty, sacrifice. He's proven that his father was wrong, that he's worth far more than he was ever given credit for. The man who woke up reaching for pills in a trailer at the start of Season 1 would hardly recognise who he became. But that transformation wasn't magic. It was the result of consistent choices to engage with life rather than hide from it, to protect people even when protection might lead to pain, to open his heart even when his heart had been shattered before. Hopper's redemption arc teaches that it's never too late to change, that trauma doesn't have to define you forever, that love can heal even the deepest wounds if you're brave enough to accept it. Jim Hopper's story is ultimately about hope. It's about the possibility of recovery, the power of connection, the importance of allowing yourself to be vulnerable even when vulnerability terrifies you. He went from believing he destroyed everything he touched to building a family that chose him as much as he chose them. He went from hiding in substances and isolation to fighting monsters and conspiracies and his own demons. He went from I am the curse, to I need you, to finding peace with who he'd become. That's redemption. That's what it looks like when someone refuses to give up on themselves, even when giving up would be easier. That's the power of second chances, the beauty of transformation, the proof that our past doesn't have to be our future. Looking forward, as Stranger Things heads toward its final season, Hopper stands in a very different place than where we found him. He's reunited with 11, officially together with Joyce, surrounded by people who care about him and whom he cares about in return. The isolated, substance-abusing chief from Season 1 seems like a different person entirely, and in many ways he is. But the journey isn't over. The threats facing Hawkins are more severe than ever. Vecna and the Upside Down represent existential dangers that will require everything Hopper has learned about courage, sacrifice, and love. But unlike at the beginning, when he fought mostly because he had nothing to lose, Hopper now fights because he has everything to lose. He has a family, he has love, he has purpose. These connections make him more vulnerable, but also stronger, more determined, more capable of genuine heroism. The transformation of Jim Hopper from broken veteran to protective father to loving partner represents one of the most complete character arcs in modern television. His journey acknowledges that trauma is real and lasting, while demonstrating that healing is possible. It honours the pain of loss, while celebrating the courage required to love again. It recognises that our past shapes us, without letting that past become our prison. For viewers who have struggled with loss, who've dealt with feeling cursed or broken, who've questioned whether they could ever move past trauma that seems insurmountable. Hopper's story offers genuine hope. Change is possible. Healing is possible. Opening your heart after it's been shattered is possible. It won't be easy. It won't be quick, but it's possible, and it's worth it. Hopper's redemption arc reminds us that being a hero doesn't require superpowers or supernatural abilities. Sometimes heroism looks like getting up in the morning when you'd rather stay in bed. Sometimes it looks like allowing yourself to care when caring might lead to hurt. Sometimes it looks like choosing connection over isolation, vulnerability over walls, love over fear. That's the heroism Hopper models, and it's available to anyone brave enough to try. So here's to Jim Hopper. Vietnam veteran, failed father, recovered detective, chief of police, adoptive dad, romantic partner, monster fighter, and most importantly, living proof that our worst moments don't have to define us. Here's to the journey from I am the curse to I need you. Here's to second chances and found families and the courage to keep fighting even when fighting seems pointless. Here's to redemption. If you enjoyed diving deep into Hopper's backstory and transformation, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Stranger Things lore content. There's so much more to explore in this universe, so many more stories to tell, so many more connections to make. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop new content exploring the depths of Hawkins and the people who call it home. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Jim Hopper's past, his pain, and his ultimate redemption. Until next time, keep the lights on and watch out for what might be lurking in the dark.